They didn't even say goodbye. One morning they were there, humans scattered across starports and colonies, bartering in trade hubs, arguing at council chambers, and drinking too much in dive bars orbiting black hole observatories. Then suddenly they weren't. No official transmission. No final meeting. No war. No plague. Just absence. At first, the Galactic Council barely noticed. Humanity, while loud and unpredictable, was still one of the newer species to join the Council. They had arrived just 2 centuries ago, a blink in galactic time, but they had surged through space faster than anyone expected, colonized 13 planets, established trade with over 40 species, and started dozens of joint science programs. They were active, restless. But when they vanished, they left a silence. Not just from the chatter, it was in the numbers. Galactic shipping traffic dropped by 17% overnight. Pirate activity increased because the humans' patrol fleets had disappeared. Even entertainment industries felt it. No more Terran dramas, no music, no stupid but addictive games. Still, the Council didn't panic. They called it a strategic withdrawal. Some species even celebrated. The Krell High Priest declared it divine justice for humans daring to push their fragile biology into sacred voids. The Valthuri simply shrugged. They were never built for peace anyway, one delegate said. But then the system started failing. Human-coded maintenance AIs abandoned their stations. Terraforming protocols reversed on 3 planets. Hundreds of joint research stations powered down simultaneously. In the cryostasis vaults of the asteroid belt, over 1 million human embryos were erased from the banks, deliberately. And that's when the fear began to settle. It was the Tharine ambassador, old, wise, and known for never speaking unless he absolutely had to, who finally stood before the High Council and said, "You do not understand what you have lost. You should be afraid." The chamber laughed. At first. But one by one, the surviving diplomats and intelligence agents began to report similar findings. Humanity hadn't just left. They had cleaned their footprints. Every joint project with humans was destroyed or locked behind unbreakable encryption. Even cultural exchange databases had been wiped clean. It was like they had never existed. Except they had. And they had done a lot in a short time. And maybe that's what unsettled the Council most of all. Because deep down, everyone remembered the human trait they had ignored for so long. They learned fast, fought harder, forgave slowly, but most of all, they planned. And now, with them gone, there was a shadow stretching across the stars. A silence so complete it felt like the inhale before a scream. 3 weeks later, the Veroni front collapsed. A quiet war humans had helped hold back was now raging unchecked. 10 council worlds fell in days. The council called emergency meetings. Systems were pulled from reserve fleets. Ancient races offered up dreadnoughts thought buried in peace treaties. But the dominoes didn't stop falling. In a private session, the serene archivist whispered what others feared to say aloud. What if they knew this was coming? What if they left because of it? But worse still, what if humanity hadn't abandoned the galaxy? What if they had simply stepped away to prepare? The first system to go completely dark was Halvrin 9. A quiet trade hub orbiting a neutron star, Halvrin 9 had been stable for over 600 cycles. Known for its cobalt exports and the serene mix of Vari and Shulan populations, the system rarely saw conflict. It was peaceful, neutral, a place the Galactic Council often used for negotiations and covert diplomacy. But now, it was gone. Not destroyed, not attacked, just silent. No outgoing transmissions, no freighters, no distress calls. When a scout ship from the Arventi Collective was sent to investigate, it never came back. That was when fear truly began to gnaw at the core of the Council. Because in all their millennia of history, across wars and genocides and collapses, never had an entire system disappeared without a trace. There was always something: wreckage, comms chatter, radiation trails. But Halvrin 9 had simply ceased to respond. And no one wanted to admit the pattern was spreading. One by one, the systems where humans had once left a mark, whether by building, conquering, negotiating, or defending, began to falter. Not in ways obvious or dramatic, but subtle and terrifying. A black market in the Garn wastes dried up overnight. The wormhole network in Sector 12G suffered a spontaneous failure. The Foreign Institute of Astrobiology found every human-authored document in their archive had been replaced with static. Even the Council's mainframe, believed to be the most secure computational system in known space, began to display anomalies. Not hacks, not malware, just missing pieces, holes, like someone had reached inside the code and pulled knowledge out. And still, no one could find a single human. It had been 4 months. The Jethari, a species famous for their emotionless analysis and hyper-logic, put forth the first public theory. Humanity had ascended, left the galaxy, evolved into non-corporeal beings. It was laughed off by most, but only because the alternative was worse. A quiet emergency meeting was held in the deep core, the most secure council sanctuary, built into the iron heart of a neutron star. Only the 12 prime species were allowed to attend, the ones who had shaped galactic law, enforced peace, and guarded the balance for over 20 millennia. 12 voices, 12 minds, and a silence between them thicker than vacuum. The Cyrene archivist broke it first. "They're not gone." All eyes turned. I mean, not gone, not extinct, not dead. They just stepped away. "They're hiding." "Hiding from what?" hissed the Zoltri regent. "They were the threat." "No," replied the archivist. "They were the buffer." That single word shifted the energy in the room. Buffer. The idea sat in their minds, creeping in like frost. Because it made a terrible kind of sense. Humanity had been everywhere, not in a dominant way, not officially, but they had slipped into every conflict zone, every trade hub, every dangerous expedition. They had acted like thrill-seekers, adventurers, opportunists. But now, maybe it hadn't been chaos. Maybe it had been containment. The Council had always mocked them for their unpredictability, their primitive aggression, their instinctive need to prepare for war even during peace. But maybe, just maybe, they had seen what no one else had. And while the rest of the galaxy relaxed in its treaties and complacency, humanity had been bracing for something bigger. Something terrible. But what? That question hovered over everything now, because the disappearances were accelerating. Entire merchant fleets were vanishing, outposts going dark, patrol ships finding silent, abandoned stations, air still fresh, meals still hot, no bodies. It wasn't an invasion, it was an erasure. And still, no word from Earth. Not that Earth was reachable anymore. The Sol system was one of the first to lock itself behind a cascading firewall of quantum defenses, black hole gravity folds, and something the Council didn't even recognize, a sort of time warp barrier that made scanning results come back before they were sent. Every probe failed. Every attempt to reach it bounced back or disappeared into nothing. It was no longer a star system. It was a fortress, or maybe a tomb. The Krell, warlike and ancient, decided to test it. They sent 3 dreadnoughts into Sol space, heavy, shielded, armed with every weapon known to their race. None came back. No explosion, no signal, no trace, just gone. and on the next rotation, something else vanished. Krell's second moon. One day it was in orbit. The next, it wasn't. No crater, no debris. It had been taken. The message was clear and chilling. The Council scrambled. Across the galaxy, panic set in. The Dalari closed their borders. The Uran began mass-producing warships, even though they had sworn off violence 1,000 cycles ago. The Dren started hoarding food and converting universities into bunkers. But none of it mattered, because the systems that disappeared didn't follow a pattern. They weren't clustered by region, species, or strategic value. They had only one thing in common: human presence, past or present. That's when a minor official from the Archivum, barely known, half-mad but fluent in 100 dead languages, uncovered something forgotten. A message from a human general, buried in a transcript from 80 years ago after the Battle of Velarin Spires. It read, "We didn't come to conquer your galaxy. We came because we saw what's coming. You think peace is normal? We know it's not. You call us paranoid. We call it preparation. When we leave, that's when you should panic." The message was dismissed at the time. Too melodramatic. Typical human bravado. But now, it read like prophecy. The worst part? The last line. "We're not your saviors. We're your warning." Back in the deep core, the Council was falling apart. Alliances broke, accusations flew, a dozen species threatened to split, to isolate themselves, to prepare for a war that had no enemy and no front. But they were already too late. One by one, messages began to arrive. Encrypted, untraceable, unmistakably human. Each one was tailored to its recipient, using old codes, private channels, languages known only to former ambassadors and captains long dead. They all said the same thing. "Do not follow, do not search, do not call. We tried, you ignored. Now you face what we fled." And then the last line. "This is not abandonment. It is mercy." Some thought it a bluff. Others called it psychological warfare. But those who had truly known humans fought beside them, drank with them, mourned with them, recognized the tone. Regret, warning, resolve. Not a threat, a farewell. And then Earth reappeared. Not fully, not physically, just a signal. A soft pulse, transmitted once every standard cycle, encoded in human binary. Simple, chilling. Let it burn. That was when the Council realized the terrible truth. Humans hadn't run from the enemy. They had seen that the enemy couldn't be defeated, only delayed. So they had fought it, secretly, for as long as they could, held the line, and when they could no longer hold it, they left. Not to escape, but to lure the enemy away. They took it with them, dragged it into their hidden fortresses, their sealed systems, their abandoned outposts. They made themselves the bait. To give the galaxy time, to let it breathe even for a while longer. And the Council had laughed at them, had mocked their fear, their paranoia. And now, with the humans gone, the darkness they had held back was no longer leashed. It was free, and the stars began to die. By the 7th month, the cracks in the Galactic Council weren't metaphorical anymore. Whole sectors had stopped responding. Travel between core systems became dangerous. Once flourishing trade routes were now ghost corridors filled with drifting cargo vessels and silent, floating debris. Long-range communications began to distort, repeating broken echoes of past messages. Sometimes they'd receive Council broadcasts days before they were even sent. Time was bleeding, In Sector HFY-11, suns were reported to be dimming, not fading naturally, but flickering like dying torches. Some scientists whispered of entropy acceleration, while others insisted it was sabotage. But the data told one truth. The galaxy was no longer stable. The Jathari proposed another hypothesis, this one even more unthinkable than their last. "This is not a threat that exists in physical dimensions," their speaker stated with cold clarity. "It is a sentient decay. It feeds on memory, presence, identity. Where humans resisted it, we now forget ourselves." That would have sounded insane a year ago. Now, it was the sanest thing anyone had said in weeks. Entire colonies were reporting fades, not deaths, but disappearances without violence. Workers on a station would report to duty only to realize one of their colleagues no longer existed. Not missing, not removed, just gone, as if they'd never been born. No records, no belongings. Sometimes the names disappeared from minds entirely. Some species tried memory link rituals to hold on. The Vari formed telepathic circles, reliving the names of the fallen, chanting to remember the dead who had not yet died. But even they began to forget. The council met again. What was left of it? Only 6 species now remained with full communication across their regions. The rest were dark, offline, possibly extinct. The meeting took place in the orbit of Galen Primus, a dying star where gravity anomalies made detection difficult. Every delegate looked more ragged than the last. Once adorned in ceremonial robes and armor, now they were wrapped in pragmatic suits, worn metal, and pale worry. "We have to find them," the Krell representative growled. Her voice had lost its arrogance. "They can't have gone far. Their ships weren't that advanced." "You still think this is about ships?" snapped the Cyrene. "You think they ran? You still don't understand?" The Krell slammed her fist on the table. "Then explain it!" The Serene closed her ancient, half-blind eyes and whispered, "We are not facing war. We are facing erasure, and humanity was our firewall." Everyone fell silent. That term again. Firewall. The idea had taken hold across council whispers. Humans weren't just another species. They were a filter, a trap. Something had come for the galaxy long ago, and humanity had made itself its enemy. Not for glory, not for conquest, but to distract it. The Jathari offered the final analysis. "It is possible humanity did not evolve naturally," their speaker said. "Their aggression, adaptability, emotional chaos, all traits hostile to standard galactic behavior, but perfect for confusion, for resistance, like antibodies." "You're saying they were created?" I'm saying they created themselves, to fight something no one else could." It was then the council agreed. If there was any hope, it lay in Earth. But Earth was still closed. No ship had made it past the sole defense net. No signal had received a reply. Not even automated probes from within their own systems could breach the blacked-out zone that now surrounded the Terran region, until someone did. Not a ship. A voice. It came from the ruins of the Trilithium Relay, a system long abandoned and stripped for parts. A broken signal, distorted, fractured, but undeniably human. "Told you not to search." It repeated every 4.7 minutes. "Warned you, you didn't listen." Then finally, "You think this is about survival. It's not. It's about containment." The council went still. Every translator paused. And then the voice said something that chilled every species to their bone analogues. "It remembers you now." Across the galaxy, a subtle shift began. Stars dimmed slightly. Black holes pulsed. Even space, cold, empty space, began to feel aware, as if something behind it was watching. The next day, 2 more core worlds disappeared. Not exploded. Not invaded. Just erased. The digital star maps updated in real time. One blink, they were there. Next blink, only empty grid space. The names of the planets didn't appear on any charts afterward. People had to be reminded they even existed. Entire civilizational centers, forgotten like a dream. And then came the dreams. Species that didn't even sleep began reporting intrusive thought patterns. Dark oceans filled with screaming shadows, cities twisting into non-Euclidean spirals, faces without eyes whispering in dead languages. It was entering their minds. Whatever it was, it didn't need ships or fleets. It didn't fire weapons. It infected. It consumed from within. And humans had fought it the only way they knew how, by becoming impossible to predict, impossible to calculate, chaos in flesh. And now that chaos was gone. The final breaking point came when the Council lost contact with the vaults of Luthen, a secret archive that held the genetic libraries of 57 species. The vaults were protected by the most advanced AI in the galaxy, the human-created Sentinel Class 6 system. It was supposed to be impenetrable. Now, the mainframe was empty. Every stored DNA record wiped. Every human record deleted completely. The rest corrupted, glitched. Some files had mutated, names warped into symbols that didn't exist. Species codes overwritten with static that crashed any system that tried to read them. And on the floor of the vault, etched into the titanium alloy, was a single sentence. "You should have let us finish the war." At this point, the Council stopped being a council. Each surviving species turned inward, pulling fleets, building bunkers, encrypting their systems and praying to whatever old gods they had left. But it was no use, because the enemy wasn't coming from outside anymore. It was already in the data, in the thoughts, in the very laws of reality. And across a dozen systems, people began whispering the same nightmare. Earth, burning in reverse. That was the only way they could describe it. The image repeated across minds, dreams, simulations. Earth on fire, but the flames didn't destroy. They erased, rewrote. Buildings melted into bone. Skies turned to static. Oceans boiled upward into the stars. And in the center, a figure. Not a god, not a monster, just a man. Not angry, not weeping, just watching. Alone. The Council, what was left, reconvened for one last attempt. They sent a message, not through words, but a single symbol. One humanity had used in their final transmissions. A burning star within a broken ring, the symbol of the last wall. It was their emergency beacon, one no species but humans ever used. The message was simple. Please, come back. For 12 cycles, there was no reply. Then, finally, one word. From Earth. Translated from ancient Terran English. No. And then, silence again. But this time the stars pulsed once. Faint, but definite. As if in warning. As if humanity wasn't gone after all. As if they were waiting, watching, holding the darkness behind the veil. But barely. Because now, the galaxy had noticed. And the darkness was remembering. The darkness began whispering names. It started as static. Harmless, incomprehensible noise echoing through abandoned satellites and relay stations. Then came the patterns. Fragments of long-forgotten council meetings, intercepted human transmissions, snippets of music once broadcast from Terran colonies. Soon after, entire sentences crawled through the channels like insects under the skin of the galaxy. We see you. You are not alone. You left us nothing but noise. Now you will drown in it. The council didn't respond. Because there was no council anymore, just fractured fragments of once mighty civilizations trying to hold their pieces together. The core alliance was gone. The Krell Empire had descended into civil war. The Velthuri, once considered the most psychologically resilient species in the quadrant, had gone entirely silent. Not destroyed, not overtaken, just mute. Their star systems no longer pulsed in council tracking grids. Ships that tried to enter their space never came back. The few that did returned empty. Crew missing, walls scribbled with symbols that twisted when looked at directly. The Cyrene, keepers of memory, had started losing theirs. It was a cruel irony. A species whose minds were genetically engineered to retain every moment of their lives now found their memories breaking like old glass. Counselors forgot their own names. Parents forgot their children. History began collapsing in real time. They reached out one last time to Earth. No response, not even static. Earth was now locked beneath layers of quantum encryption so thick it was barely detectable, like it had folded itself out of existence and chose not to be found. Like a bunker not against bombs, but against the very concept of being. The last surviving scientist of the Jathari proposed a new term: existential compression. Humanity didn't leave, he said. They imploded. Not in matter, but in probability. They collapsed their relevance, became statistically invisible, a ghost in the equations of causality. No one understood what he meant. 2 days later, he gouged out his own eyes with a data crystal and screamed a single word before jumping into the singularity chamber. Remember. No one spoke of him again. The galaxy was unraveling. But not chaotically. Not like war. It was clean, quiet, systematic. One by one, aspects of civilization vanished. Navigation maps glitched. Planetary coordinates defaulted to zeros. Artificial intelligences turned themselves off. And still, the whispers grew louder. Then something new happened. A rogue signal burst across 45 systems simultaneously. It didn't come from any one source. It was the source. A voice, feminine, calm, distinctly human. You rejected chaos. You rejected violence. You called us unstable. Now stability fails, and only we knew how to fight that. The message paused. You wanted a perfect galaxy. You forgot perfection invites rot. You forgot entropy has teeth. No one traced the signal. No one could. It was present in too many places at once, sent not through transmission but through reality itself, like the universe had been infected with human defiance. Then came the real blow. One of the surviving core species, the Delari, launched a desperate expedition to Sol. 5 ships, experimental warp jump tech, no AI guidance, just raw neural drive and instinct. Only one ship arrived. And it didn't enter Earth's system. It fell into orbit around Mars. Mars, the red planet humanity had once transformed into a second home, now cloaked in storms and surrounded by debris rings made of broken satellites. The crew of the Delari ship reported a single signal from Mars' surface. Do not land. They ignored it. They were desperate, arrogant, and dying. They landed anyway. What happened next was broadcast to every known species in the galaxy. Not by Earth, not by the ship, by something else. Every device, every screen, every translator unit flashed the same image. The Delari crew, stepping out of their vessel, weapons ready, sensors active. And then they stopped. In the recording, time seemed to hesitate, frames stuttering like a corrupted file. And then the crew began to dissolve. Not melt, not burn, just erase. Skin vanished, bones turned to vapor, clothing unraveled into threads of light. Their screams never came. They didn't seem to understand what was happening, just confused, frozen mid-step, as their very identities unmade themselves. In 6 seconds, they were gone. And then the signal ended with one sentence. They tried to understand what was never meant to be known. The galaxy descended into madness after that. Entire cultures burned their archives. Memory was now dangerous. Knowing things made them vulnerable. Even saying the word Earth became taboo among fringe colonies. Some species went dark willingly, destroyed their own tech, turned to pre-spacefaring ways, abandoned cities and satellites. They called it the Great Reversion. A chance to hide in ignorance, believing that without complexity, the darkness would pass them over. But the darkness didn't care. You could forget humanity. It wouldn't forget you. Among the last surviving academic circles, a desperate theory formed. That humanity had not just fled, or imploded, or vanished, but that they had taken something with them. The memory key, a metaphysical anchor, a concept older than time, the glue that held identities together across timelines. And without it, reality was unraveling. Humans had been the keepers of it, unknowingly or deliberately, and in taking it with them, they'd left the rest of the galaxy vulnerable to something older than even the stars. Entropy wasn't just a natural process, it was alive. It waited, watching for when civilizations grew complacent, when order tried to replace instinct, when comfort turned into decay, and it had found its moment. But humans had known, had seen the signs in their brief, brutal existence, had fought back the only way they knew how. And when they couldn't win, they ran into the fire, dragging the enemy with them, sacrificing themselves not to survive, but to buy the rest of the galaxy a little more time. Not enough, as it turned out. But no one could question their effort anymore. The species who once mocked their wars, their contradictions, their obsession with death, now prayed to the echoes they'd left behind. Old Earth transmissions became sacred texts. Human music played in shelters like hymns. Even their curses were memorized, little shields of identity against the unmaking storm. Some species tried to imitate them. They failed, because to be human wasn't about strength or technology or intelligence. It was about defiance in the face of certainty, about spitting into the void and daring it to swallow you. And now, with the void swallowing everything, the galaxy understood what it had lost. At the edge of the spiral arm, in a forgotten sector, an old observation drone flickered to life. Its systems had long been dead, but something had reactivated it. Inside its visual range, the stars blinked strangely, almost deliberately. The drone recorded the pattern, a series of dots and pauses, Morse code. Human, it translated, "This is not your ending, but it is your reckoning." And then, "We're still here. You just don't know how to see us anymore." The drone's memory core overheated. Its last transmission was a single image of a shadow standing on the edge of a broken moon, looking out toward the galactic center. A human silhouette. Alone. Watching. Waiting. Holding the line. The stars began dying in patterns. Not randomly, not like supernovas triggered by age or gravitational collapse. These were deliberate, precise extinctions, stars snuffed out in sequences like someone was deleting constellations from the sky, one line at a time. Astronomers who still dared to look called it the burn script. Across every corner of the galaxy, entire civilizations tracked it, desperate to decipher meaning from the death of their own heavens. In one spiral arm, the pattern resembled ancient human numerals. In another, it echoed the glyphs carved on Terran monuments in places called Egypt and Machu Picchu. The implication sent tremors through the surviving scientific communities. The darkness wasn't just destroying. It was speaking, and for those who could still hear human frequencies, it was doing so through them. But Earth remained silent. No messages, no ships, no warnings, just the dense, impenetrable curtain of distorted space-time and inverted gravitational locks that had sealed the Sol system from the galaxy. Until now. The seal flickered. Not open, not broken, just leaked. Enough for one final broadcast to make it through. Not an alert, not a warning, not even a message, a song. A human voice, soft and low, whispering in old Terran English, a lullaby barely above a whisper. Hush now, stars, don't you cry, the dark will pass you by, the fire sleeps beneath our skin and waits to rise again. Beats, it played once across every known frequency. No one admitted it publicly, but nearly every sentient species wept when they heard it. Some cried because of its melody. Others cried because of what it meant, that humanity hadn't forgotten them. They had just chosen silence over chaos, isolation over annihilation, sacrifice over vengeance. In the fractured remains of the Uran conclaves, something stirred. The Uran had long been known for their pacifism, their absolute dedication to peace after centuries of war had nearly torn their race apart. For 3,000 cycles, they had outlawed weaponry, destroyed all military knowledge, and built a society founded entirely on diplomacy and healing. But now, their planetary archives glowed with light. Not from within, from below. In the oldest level of their deepest vault, a single door opened for the first time in millennia. Not because anyone accessed it, because someone had triggered it. A human handprint, encoded in ancient material from the first Uran contact team, was registered as active. The vault opened. Inside they found files not written by Uran hands. They were human instructions, labeled clearly. For when the silence begins. Inside the files, schematics, engines, weapons, psychological manuals on how to endure a war against an enemy that cannot be seen, heard, or even remembered. And at the end of the files, a single note. Written in a language the Uran had never learned, yet every one of them understood as if it were in their native tongue. We knew you wouldn't want to fight. We knew you'd choose peace. That's why we did the fighting for you. But when the walls fall, you'll have to choose again. The Uran didn't hesitate. Their council voted unanimously for the first time in recorded history. They activated the forges and began building ships again. Human ships. Meanwhile, in the shadow systems of the Dren, where memory had nearly collapsed and entire family lines had forgotten themselves, a miracle happened. A child spoke a name, not their own, not their parents', a name no Dren had ever spoken aloud in thousands of cycles. Amelia. The name of a human diplomat who had once brokered peace between the Dren and the Varoni, long before the Dren had developed voice harmonics. She had taught them language. She had died defending their moon colonies when the Varoni betrayed the treaty. Her name had been wiped from their digital records during the early days of the unraveling. But now, a child born in full memory fade had whispered it in perfect Terran cadence. The Dren fell to their knees. They wept and rebuilt her statue. And the child kept speaking. Names, coordinates, instructions, not prophecy, not gibberish. A map. The child had been activated, not by implants, not by code, but by something older. Humanity had seeded memory anchors into the bloodlines of species they believed would endure. They didn't trust data, didn't trust servers. They trusted stories. And now the stories were waking up. All across the galaxy, small awakenings began. Half-broken drones flickering back to life with encoded messages. Half-forgotten ruins rearranging themselves into star charts. Hybrid children born of human and alien parentage, suddenly gaining knowledge they had never been taught. And every message was the same. Prepare. On a rogue moon in the dead system of Vassen's grave, a signal beacon built into a mountain activated. It broadcast an ancient human phrase. Alpha protocol engaged. Countdown inverted. Across hidden facilities in forgotten corners of the galaxy, deep beneath the crusts of abandoned mining worlds and sealed beneath ancient oceans, humanity's final gift began to unfold. Machines blinked online. Shields rose. Bunkers opened. Not for themselves, not for humans, for the others. The ones who had listened, who had remembered, who had mourned their absence. It became clear now. This was never about humanity saving itself. It was about giving the galaxy a second chance. Humanity knew they could not destroy the enemy. They had tried. For hundreds of years, secretly, they had fought, studied, and contained it. But it was never going to be enough. So they left. To become its obsession. To pull it toward them and away from everything else. And while the galaxy panicked and fractured, they had laid the groundwork. Planted seeds, left instructions, set traps, because they knew the truth that no other species dared admit. Survival was not an accident. It was a strategy. And humans were the strategists. The enemy had started to realize this too. The unmaking was slowing. The whispers becoming erratic. It had followed them. It had fed on chaos for eons. But humanity had changed the rules. They weren't feeding it chaos anymore. They were feeding it order with teeth. Which meant one terrifying, hopeful thing. Humanity was fighting back. Where? No one knew. How? No one could guess. But the patterns were clear now. The void that once spread like a sickness was now condensing, not retracting, being dragged. Dragged by the will of a species who had nothing left but rage and purpose. Dragged by ghosts who refused to die quietly. And then, one last transmission broke through. Across all remaining frequencies, from dead stars to broken relays, the message rang out. Human, calm, certain. We see you. We hear you. You are not alone. Followed by a single line. We're holding the line. Just keep remembering us. The galaxy stirred. And for the first time in what felt like eternity, it remembered what hope felt like. Hope was a strange thing in a dying galaxy. It crept in not like a roar, but a flicker, one barely noticeable above the hum of entropy and fear. But now, that flicker was spreading, glowing like coals beneath the ashes. Everywhere the darkness had touched, where systems were silenced and stars devoured, life stirred. Not because the enemy had retreated, but because it had been distracted. More than distracted. Diverted. Contained. Challenged. Something was holding the collapse in check, not stopping it, but slowing it, turning the unstoppable tide into a controlled leak, the difference between a tsunami and a drip. And the galaxy began to understand. Humanity hadn't escaped the darkness. They had invited it in, and now they were fighting it alone. But that wasn't the end of the message. It was just the beginning. Because now they were asking for help, not in words, not in pleas, but in actions only the desperate could understand. In systems once wiped clean of data, now appeared messages buried in biological code, reprogrammed algae, crystal growth patterns, even in the magnetic echoes of vanished moons. All read the same in any translation system: you have to remember us. You have to choose to. It wasn't just a fight against the darkness. It was a fight against forgetting. Because forgetting was its weapon. Oblivion, not through fire, but through erasure. And remembering was resistance. The planet Maris had been considered lost for weeks. No messages, no signals, no ships returned. A silent graveyard orbiting a red dwarf with 100 million souls buried in its crust. Then one day, it blinked back online. Not fully, not clearly, but with a pulse, like a heart skipping a beat. A single steady signal pinged out every 88 seconds from its oldest communications tower. When decoded, it was just one word: Jones. At first, no one understood. Then an old historian among the Vorthians gasped aloud. The name belonged to an Earthborn engineer who had helped build the Maris planetary core when it was first terraformed. No statue bore his name. No records in the current planetary government even acknowledged his involvement. But someone had remembered. Something had remembered. And that was enough. The darkness couldn't claim Maris again. It had been anchored. That was the key. That's what humanity had always known. The war wasn't about winning. It was about resisting until the end of time, not with weapons, with memory, with story. And now those stories were waking up. Across the galaxy, the silent allies of humanity, those too weak, too afraid, or too naive to act when humans begged them to unite, were finally finding their voice. The Uran had completed their first fleet. 10 ships, old in design but enhanced by human schematics, hidden under layers of emotion-based encryption. The ships weren't just armed, they were resilient. Their navigation systems used memory pattern logic, built to survive even if every map was lost. Their AIs were structured like myths, self-replicating across time. The Drenchild who remembered Amelia now had followers, thousands. The child no longer slept. Didn't need to. Something had changed. Her body thrived on narrative energy, on being spoken of. The more people repeated her words, the more real she became. They called her the living archive. And she had a message of her own. They are building something, not a weapon, not a fleet, a cage. A cage for the darkness, a final permanent prison, a plan millennia in the making, the final human act. But it wasn't ready yet, because a cage isn't enough. A cage needs guards. And that was why the memories were reawakening, not to resurrect humanity, but to prepare their replacements. The Krell, once warlords, now fragmented survivors, heard their own call. From deep beneath the magma layers of their third homeworld, something broke free. An ancient vault untouched since the pre-spacefaring era. Inside were no weapons, just a voice. Human. Male. Weathered. If you're hearing this, it means we failed to return. And that means you're next. But you don't have to fight the way we did. You just have to remember how we did it. Then coordinates. Then silence. The Krell war clans, once fractured, reformed under one banner. The Pact of the Final Memory. They didn't return to war. They returned to protection. They began rebuilding libraries, collecting stories, documenting everything. Because they now understood that the most powerful weapon wasn't destruction. It was truth remembered long enough to defy forgetting. In the galactic core, the last surviving members of the original council received a transmission. Encrypted, multi-layered, old enough to predate most of their recorded digital systems. It bore one symbol, a Terran flame, surrounded by 12 stars. The original UN Space Alliance insignia. Inside the transmission was a list, not of weapons, not of orders, but of people, names, species, acts of kindness. A merchant from the Delari who smuggled Terran refugees out of a war zone. A Velthuri scientist who stayed behind during the Black Flu and saved thousands. A serene poet who translated Terran loss into songs that helped entire colonies grieve. The list was titled, "Those Worth Saving." The final line? "If you're on this list, then this fight was never about us. It was about giving you a chance. Don't waste it." And yet, despite the hope, the darkness was not done. It still devoured systems, still erased names from history, still clawed its way into minds and made civilizations forget what the stars once meant. But it was no longer unopposed. Now it faced resistance in every memory spoken aloud, in every child taught a story of humans, in every culture that chose to remember instead of erase. In every heartbeat of those still fighting, humanity lived on. And across the ruined expanse of the spiral arms, strange beacons flickered. Not human, not alien. Something new. The first lights of a generation not defined by their origin, but by their purpose. And then, one final miracle. In the deepest system, one the darkness had already claimed, a blackened zone thought beyond saving, a ship emerged. Old Earth design, burned, scarred, half its hull missing, but alive. No weapons, just a message etched into its side in fire-resistant paint. "We're still here." And inside? No humans, just an interface, a hologram, of a Terran woman with gray eyes and a smile full of exhausted pride. She looked directly at the camera and said, "We've done all we can. If you're seeing this, then you're ready. We'll hold the line until we can't. But the cage is yours to finish." Then she added, "And when you do, tell our story right." The ship vanished into light, and the galaxy, wounded and reeling, began to build. Not for war, not for revenge, but for legacy. Humanity had left behind no empire, no monuments, no armies, just memories. And memories now were the most dangerous thing in the universe. The stars were quiet now, not in the way they had been when death loomed, but in the way a battlefield falls silent before the final charge. Something had shifted across the galaxy. The chaos that once crept unchecked, the cold certainty of erasure that rolled in like fog, had begun to meet resistance not in fire or force, but in remembrance. Stories, those once dismissed as cultural fluff or sentimental weakness, had become fortresses. Entire colonies had stopped relying on traditional communication protocols and turned to storytelling as their primary method of passing information. Oral histories, songs, symbolic dances that carried the memory of human sacrifice across species who couldn't even speak in words. Not one of these was digitally stored, because the enemy fed on records. But it choked on ritual, on repetition, on living memory that changed with the teller, yet remained the same in essence. The Vari, long considered too logical for myth, now held weekly gatherings under open sky where elders recited human history in verse. They wept as they spoke of Terran rage and resilience, of cities rebuilt from ash, of love that endured radiation storms and families that held together under orbital siege. Their newest children were named things like Hope, Anders, Nova, and Elliot, names once foreign, now sacred, because names had power now, and the darkness feared them, somewhere beyond the known edge of galactic space, past the once mapped territories of the Orion Veil. An enormous structure was being built. No species admitted to designing it. No shipyards claimed its construction. But it was there. A lattice of blacklight steel and crystalline memory conductors orbiting an ancient neutron star. The structure was larger than any known space station. Larger, even, than most moons. It was shaped like a spiral, and in the center, suspended within a vacuum shell, was a single human body, perfectly preserved. Not decaying, not alive. A man in a tattered, old-style United Terran Federation uniform, dog tags still clinging to his neck. No one knew who he was, but those who saw him in person felt a strange pressure in their chests, a weight of sorrow and gratitude. Some whispered that it was the first human. Others said he was the last one left. But the station's true name became known through the whispers that carried across radiation winds and gravity wells. The Lament Engine. And it wasn't built to fight. It was built to sing. Engineers who tried to understand it went mad. Pilots who flew near it described dreams of childhood memories they never lived. One captain claimed he saw his own death, and still came back smiling. Whatever the Lament Engine was, it wasn't a weapon in any traditional sense. But it had power. The kind of power that couldn't be measured, only felt. And when the darkness tried to consume the station, it failed. Not with battle, not with resistance. It simply forgot what it was doing. Turned inward, lost coherence, crumbled under its own confusion, because the Lament Engine remembered everything, and forced the darkness to remember too. In a hidden quadrant near the collapsed Andari Rift, the last living human AI, designation Echo 7, activated. Not because it had been summoned, but because the conditions had finally been met. The stars had dimmed. Memory beacons had been lit. Stories had spread. And now, the next phase could begin. Echo 7 didn't have a voice in the traditional sense. It communicated through harmonic resonance, tones that shook the core of any sentient listener, bypassing language and going straight to feeling. Its first transmission was a pulse that made the children of 6 species cry at once. Its second was a key. Encoded instructions. A fragment of an ancient algorithm known only to the deepest Earth-based think tanks and passed biologically through augmented Terran descendants. The algorithm had one function: to teach others how to forget in the right way, to erase memory intentionally, leaving behind protected blanks that the darkness could not consume, like cutting away infected limbs to preserve the body. Species began training for it. The Serene adapted their mind melds. The Dren child guided new groups through dream-forging rituals. Even the cold Jathari uploaded fragments of their consciousness into Echo's memory prism, voluntarily letting pieces of themselves go in order to become harder to erase. It was a cruel process, painful, traumatic, but it worked. The darkness couldn't feed on what had been sealed in the vault of self-sacrifice. The process came to be known as the hollowing, a last resort, a permanent shield, a whisper in the void saying, "You cannot take what we chose to give up." But it still wasn't enough. The darkness wasn't giving up. It had followed humanity across voids, into their hidden systems, into the places even light no longer entered, and now it was evolving, changing, learning. For the first time since it began devouring existence, it sent a message back. Not through words, but through corruption. Every galactic beacon, every linguistic AI, every ancient monument, and even the lament engine flickered with one phrase: "You were not made to resist. You were made to kneel." It was not a threat. It was a declaration, and in dozens of places resistance broke. Small systems collapsed, minds snapped. Children were born, memory dead, souls clean, untouched and unreachable. The darkness was winning, not because it was stronger, but because humanity was running out of time. And that's when the cage began to move. The thing humanity had been building, not a weapon, not a fleet, but something bigger, began to hum across systems where no human lived anymore. It wasn't located in a single place. It was everywhere, and its name? Project Ashes. The name came from a Terran saying, buried deep in their literature and whispered across battlefields, "From ashes, we rise." The cage wasn't a structure. It was a trigger. A synchronized, multi-layered sequence of psychological, technological, gravitational, and narrative anchors hidden across every species that had ever made contact with Earth. And now, they were all awake. Species who had once been enemies aligned their frequencies. Ruins of fallen empires began to resonate. The Dren child collapsed into a coma, but her pulse matched the heartbeat of the lament engine. The Jathari uploaded their remaining cultural code into gravity servers to spin memories into the vacuum itself. The Urin completed their final ship. Not to fight, but to sing. It was called the Memory of Fire, and it carried no crew, only a flame. The last remaining ember from a Terran hearth, preserved since the colonization of Mars. A spark of home, of origin. And when that ship reached the edge of the dark, when it passed through the veil where all things were lost, it didn't vanish. It lit up the darkness, and for one brief, impossible moment, the darkness screamed, not in rage, not in triumph, but in recognition, because it saw what it had forgotten. A memory older than even the stars, the sound of defiance, the feel of a mother's warmth, the stories whispered under blankets while the wind howled outside, the smell of dirt after rain, the pain of loss, the joy of rebellion, the laughter of children. And in that instant, for the first time, the darkness knew fear. And the galaxy knew. Humanity wasn't trying to win. They were trying to teach the universe how to fight back. Even in their absence, they had become the method, the structure, the rhythm of survival. They had rewritten what it meant to endure. And as Project Ashes reached its crescendo, the galaxy held its breath. Because the final phase was near, the cage would close, and then humanity would return. But not as they were, as something else, something the darkness had no name for. Not soldiers, not saviors, not gods, but legends. The stars began to remember, not in metaphor, not in poetry, but in function. Flares that once burned wild and aimless now pulsed in sync, each burst a perfect harmonic to the one before it. Dead quasars blinked awake and pointed themselves toward a single galactic vector. Worlds lost to chaos whispered names across gravitational waves, names of humans long dead, etched into space-time itself. All of it was pointing toward a convergence. Project Ashes was nearing completion, and the galaxy was ready. The cage wasn't a prison in the traditional sense. It had no walls, no weapons, no guards. It was made of stories, memories, emotions, the intangible glue that made species more than meat and instinct. It was woven together from the moments humanity had left behind, their victories, their betrayals, their unrelenting spirit. The darkness had laughed at them once, mocked them, consumed their worlds, their digital records, their monuments. But it never understood what it had failed to kill. What it couldn't erase. Imprint. The kind of imprint that echoed in DNA, in myths, in behaviors passed between generations, even when the language that carried them was gone. Humanity didn't need to survive in flesh. They had embedded themselves in everything else. They were not a species anymore. They had become a concept, and concepts couldn't die. Now, as Project Ashes reached its final phase, the lament engine released its last signal. No voice, no text, just a frequency, a single note. It rang out across the void and reached every system where memory still held. Every soul that had whispered a human name, every colony that had lit a candle for the Terrans. And that note unlocked what had been hidden. Buried beneath 100 fractured timelines, in dormant code, in the genetic spirals of hybrid children, in the heat signatures of old battlefields, and the subconscious dreams of poets. The return code. What followed wasn't an arrival. It was a remembering. The galaxy didn't witness ships descending from the stars. There was no great flash of resurrection. There was only a moment where everyone remembered humanity at once. And in that instant, they came back. Not as soldiers in armor, not as fleets of war, not even as flesh and blood at first. They returned as presence, as pressure on the soul, an emotional gravity that couldn't be defined but couldn't be denied. On the surface of Vornus 5, where the last Krell warlord stood ready to burn his world before letting it fall to the void, a shadow stepped forward from the flames. Human. No armor, no weapons, just a tired smile and outstretched hand. "Hey," the man said. "You held out longer than we thought." The Krell dropped his blade and sank to his knees. They returned on the frozen wastes of Ithor Prime, where a tribe of Valthuri had been reduced to telepathic murmurs and shattered mind bonds. A woman stepped down from a rusted escape pod, her boots cracking the ice. "Got a little cold here, huh?" she whispered, laying her palm against the snow. "We remember you." And suddenly, the ice stopped spreading. They returned in flame and light on the edge of the Maw Rift, where the darkness had begun to coil like a serpent ready to strike. And this time, it struck first. But it hit something it hadn't expected. It hit purpose. The first real counterstrike in centuries didn't come from energy weapons or antimatter warheads. It came from a question, spoken by the youngest Dren child, guided in a dream by the living archive. "Why do you erase?" And the darkness, in all its incomprehensible mass, paused. Because it had never been asked before. It had never thought to question itself. And that pause, that tiny, fragile hesitation, was the crack in its armor. Humanity widened it. They didn't fight the darkness with brute force. They made it remember what it was before it forgot itself. They fed it memories of creation, of first suns, of joy and pain and confusion, and the darkness screamed, not in agony, but in identity crisis. It tried to flee, tried to retract, but the cage was already built. Project Ashes ignited in full. 1 trillion memory nodes, emotional anchors, relics, ruins, rituals, binding the darkness into place. Not killing it, not sealing it, just forcing it to know itself. And that broke it. It could not exist in reflection. It could only erase. And now it was surrounded by everything it had tried to destroy, a galaxy full of people remembering not just humanity, but themselves, their weaknesses, their history, their flaws, but also their fight. That was the moment the final phase began. The final Terran vessel appeared not from hyperspace or slipstream, but through probability drift. The laws of physics bent around it. Lights dimmed in reverence. Artificial intelligence constructs kneeled. The ship had no engines. It was a song. A long, low hum, composed of 1 billion whispered memories. Mothers rocking children, lovers saying goodbye, soldiers whispering apologies before pulling triggers, poets crying out for peace. Its name wasn't spoken. It didn't have one, because its identity was already written in every sentient soul. It moved through the void like a sunrise, and where it passed, the unmaking stopped. The darkness folded inward, not defeated, but made known. That was the only real victory humanity ever sought. Not domination, not even peace, but awareness, to force even the deepest void to confront the cost of forgetting, to make the universe remember that it was once full of people who lived, who loved, who fought back, and then, as quietly as they came back, they were gone, again, not dead, not erased, but at rest, because their job was done. Project Ashes sealed behind a final layer of encoded memory, a trigger that would only reawaken if the galaxy ever forgot again. And it wouldn't, because now every child born in the spiral arms is taught one thing before anything else. There were once beings called humans. They were not the strongest. They were not the smartest. But they were impossible to kill because they refused to be forgotten. In schools made of shattered ruins and rebuilt stone, teachers write the words in every tongue. We remember you, and stars, once dying, now pulse in rhythm again, carrying names across time, whispers in the void, ghosts of Earth, still watching, still waiting, just in case, because legends don't die. And humanity? Humanity had become the greatest legend the galaxy would ever know,